The bench press, probably approved globally as the gym bro movement. The only problem is, contrary to popular belief, you can't just casually lay down on a bench and then bench heavy. Technique is actually what's crucial to making physical gains, muscle gains, but also what interests us in this video, strength gains. Every top level powerlifter that you see bench a lot of weight has a very defined technique, whether it's the movement itself, but also the setup. When I won the IPF 2023 World Championship in the 66 kilo weight class, I managed to bench 172.5 kilos, which is roughly 385 pounds, at a body weight of 65 kilos, which is again roughly 144 pounds. This bench press allowed me to secure the overall win, but also bench gold. So today I'm going to teach you how I set up on the bench in order to maximize strength gains on the bench press. There are two key elements you absolutely need to get right for a strong setup. Number one is setting up the upper body, and number two is setting up the lower body, namely your legs. So let's start with the first key point, setting up the upper body for a strong bench press. There's one position you absolutely need to know, understand, and control in order to be able to have a good bench press. Your chest needs to be opened. And one cue that I really like to use is the cue big chest. So whenever you're about to bench press, before you do anything else, remember that your chest needs to be open, so that's when the cue comes in, namely big chest. In order for your chest to be open, usually you'll also need to have your shoulder blades have a given position. That's why you usually hear the cue on the bench, shoulders back, and usually that cue is to promote that big chest. In itself, I'd say it's not necessarily a bad cue to say shoulders back, but the only problem that I see is if the athlete tends to pinch his shoulder blades back too much, then what can end up happening is you have some sort of shoulder elevation, and then you're definitely not in a good position to produce a lot of force. That's why usually the cue that I like to give is shoulder blades slightly back, and slightly is the keyword here, but also slightly down. And if you have the sum of all of that shoulder positioning, you end up having this open chest, big chest position overall. So shoulders slightly back, shoulders slightly down, and then at the same time, always imagine that you want your chest to be big and open. Following those steps will ensure you have a good upper body positioning. And although understanding that is essential, it's something to be able to do it while standing up with just like a broomstick at the end of your hands. And it's something completely different to do that laying down on the bench with a 300, 400 pound barbell at the end of your hands. So that's why right now we're going to see how to actually transfer that setup over to you lying down on the bench with a 100-pound barbell at the end of your hands. When setting up at the bench, I like to first position my shoulder blades slightly back. The reasoning for that is because it's a slight positioning you have to apply, then it's not necessarily a very hard position to maintain throughout the whole movement. So once your shoulder blades are slightly back, then you almost don't need to think of it for the rest of the setup and of the movement itself. So I'll start pretty much at the middle of the bench, and from there I'll create that position and be able to maintain it throughout the whole movement. Once it's done, that's the moment where you want your shoulder blades to go slightly back and your chest to open. And so in order to accomplish that, what you'll do is you'll push with your legs towards the upper part of the bench, towards the bar basically. As much as you slide towards the upper part of the bench, what you want to do is you want to create that more down chest open position on every little inch of the setup. I'll go into more details about what to do with your legs on the second part of the video, but first, just remember you need to push with your legs in order to be able to slide towards this upper part of the bench and end up in the position we actually want to. So once you accomplish this position, then the upper body positioning is set, and from there, you're pretty much able to go do a heavy bench press. But there's actually a caveat to that, and the caveat is when you're set up, that's cool, but you still have to unrack the bar and actually complete the full rep. And what you often see, especially in beginners, is they're able to get a pretty good position before unracking the bar, but once they unrack the bar, they completely lose all of that positioning. And just to tell you, you could have the best setup possible. If when you unrack the bar, it goes to trash, then it's almost as if you didn't do any setup to bench press in the first place. So key point here, once you did that good setup, your upper body is well positioned, you have have to maintain that positioning, and one key in order to do so is instead of rolling your shoulder blades forward when you want to unrack the bar, what you want to do is actually just do a slight elbow extension, and this slight elbow extension should be enough for you to be able to unrack the bar. And if that's not the case, what it means is the rack height is just too high for you. And that could be the case for me also. If the rack is set too high, then I have absolutely no way to properly unrack the bar without losing that overall positioning, and that's where you see that error happen. So key point, when you unrack the bar, you want to keep that overall positioning, and in order to do so, you just have to do a slight elbow extension, and if that's not possible for you, just lower slightly the rack height. So now let's talk about part 2, which is the lower body setup, namely the legs. The bench press is obviously an upper body movement. The main muscles involved in the bench press are your pecs, your triceps, your shoulders, your deltoids, but at the same time, the lower body is very important for the bench press. There's a real quick experiment you can do. You can try to do a bench like you usually do with your legs on the floor, setting up, etc. And then try to do the same one, but without your legs on the floor. You'll see you're way less stable and probably way less stronger also without your leg drive. To give you a rough estimate, I would say it's between 10 and 20 kilos that you lose if your leg drive is not good. So that's why the setup with your legs is very important for the bench press, and especially if you want to maximize strength gains on the movement. The easiest way to understand leg drive on the bench press is to imagine you want to do a leg extension, but you simply want to do that leg extension movement into the ground. This simple motion will actually activate your leg drive. And to come back to my previous point, during the upper body setup, that's actually the motion that you want to visualize and the motion you want to use when pushing with your legs up until the moment you slide, and then you have the bar set up pretty much around your eyes. That's by imagining you're doing a leg extension into the ground that you slide towards the upper part of the bench, and then with that simple motion, first you have your leg drive that's now activated, and also, as we just seen, your upper body is in a good position. There are two extreme positions you actually want to avoid. Number one is having your feet way far off of your hips. Usually that's the position they'll be in, and if you just keep them that way, you won't be able to recruit a lot of leg strength into your bench. Number two, and that's true especially if you're not very flexible, is to try to have your feet way too close to your hips. You'll probably feel a good amount of tension into your legs, especially into your quads, but actually in the leg drive for the bench press, you don't really want to have a lot of quad tension because, again, it's an upper body movement. What you really want to do is be able to push very well, very firmly into the ground and transfer that force over to your upper body when there's actually the motion that's occurring. So although having your feet very, very close to your hips could feel good, usually in terms of force transfer, that's not very interesting. So that's why a general rule of thumb for me is to try to aim for a 90-degree angle at your knees. So basically, your feet will be slightly off of your hips, but not too far. But there's still one point I want to emphasize on. It's a lot of individual preferences. So if you're very flexible, you might feel better having your feet a bit closer to your hips. And if you're not very flexible, usually having your feet a bit more further away from the hips will allow for better overall positioning, but also force transfer into the bench press. We just saw the leg drive setup, but as you can see in the example that I use when I'm setting up, once my leg drive is set up, my butt is still off the bench. And the reason for that is usually unracking a bar with your butt off the bench will be way easier than to unrack the bar with your butt on the bench. It's because you're able to transfer 100% of your leg strength towards your shoulders and then be able to produce a lot of force with that unrack. But in order to have a valid bench press during a powerlifting competition, your butt needs to be on the bench. So in the same fashion as the upper body, you can actually mess up your whole positioning if you don't do things right. It's pretty much the same with the lower body with your leg drive. So if once I've unracked the bar, I just completely crumble with my butt on the bench, I'm basically losing every positioning that I just did. So what you actually want to do is you actually want to almost find slowly the contact between your butt and the bench. By doing so, you should be able to feel a lot of tension in your legs, your quads, your hamstrings, your glutes. And as long as you feel that overall tension, it usually means your leg drive is active and it's well set up. So don't do the same mistake as the upper body. Try to just control and maintain that whole positioning you just created, because once again, if you don't do that, then you're pretty much set up for nothing on the bench. And that's pretty much the setup I like to follow and I like to teach to the athletes that I coach in order to maximize the setup and maximize force production on the bench press. If you find you have trouble figuring out how to set up properly on the bench, my best advice would be to actually just on some days do a lot of setups at the same time. So try to have a list in your head that you want to follow every single time. And once you repeat that whole setup on different sessions, different weeks, different months, then at some point setting up on the bench will be just second nature to you. But if first you find out you struggle a lot with that, just create that simple list with some key points that I just said and follow that repetition every time you set up on the bench. So that was my first ever YouTube English video. That was a lot of work. Just let me know how you guys felt about it. I still have a lot more content to come, whether it's on how to optimize your technique, how to squat more, bench more, deadlift more, but actually also how to program for good strength gains, especially if you want to be a competitive powerlifter. So to make sure you don't miss any of that, just follow the channel. And also if you like the video, give a like, give a comment. And that was pretty much it for this first one. I'll see you on the next video.